The Academy Days. Part 2.
Engaging at prescribed distance, 4,200 meters. Vector 7-7, approach angle nominal. Initiating pincer maneuver on my mark.
The voice of novice Harland Ashworth crackled through the observation room's speakers with the clipped confidence of a boy who believed that doing everything correctly would be enough to keep him alive. Wyatt leaned back against the cold wall at the rear of the room, arms folded, and listened. Around him, 24 novices watched the simulation feed on the overhead display, some leaning forward with interest, others already wearing the hollow expression of those who had taken their turn and failed. On screen, Ashworth's fighter swept into the asteroid field on a textbook approach vector. Clean lines, perfect spacing, exactly the way they had been taught. He lasted 1 minute and 19 seconds. Beaumont Hale's fighter rolled out from behind a tumbling rock, closed the distance in half the time the doctrine accounted for, and put 2 simulated rounds through Ashworth's cockpit before the boy had finished calling out his next maneuver. The feed cut to static. A moment later, the simulation chamber's door hissed open, and Ashworth walked out, his face flushed with the particular shade of indignation that only a noble who had done everything right and still lost could produce. "Sensors must have been miscalibrated," he muttered to no one in particular as he took his seat. "Your sensors were fine, Lord Ashworth. Your tactics and your blue blood ass were the problem." Wyatt kept the thought buried deep and his expression carefully blank. That was the 7th kill. 7 novices, 7 eliminations, not one of them lasting longer than 1 minute and 30 seconds. And every single one of them had flown exactly as Beaumont Hale had instructed them to fly barely an hour ago. Wyatt could still hear the man's voice from the briefing room, that rich, self-important baritone that treated over 800 years of unchanged tactical doctrine as though it were divinely authored. The traditions of void combat are not suggestions, novices. They are the accumulated wisdom of generations of officers who understood that discipline, order, and adherence to proven methodology are what separate the Royal Navy from the savages and pirates that infest the void. You will engage at prescribed distances. You will announce your attack vector. You will execute only approved maneuvers. Anything less is an insult to the uniform you wear and to the Astorian Principality. Wyatt had sat through the entire lecture without moving, without reacting, his face the same mask of compliant obedience he wore to every class. But behind that mask, he had been doing what he always did, listening for the gaps. And the gaps in Beaumont Hale's doctrine were wide enough to fly a cruiser through. Prescribed engagement distances meant your enemy knew exactly when you were coming. Announcing your attack vector meant nothing more than giving them a chance to easily evade said attack, shoot back at you first, or run away. Approved maneuvers meant they knew exactly what you would do when you got there and how you'd react after. The entire system was built on the assumption that both sides would follow the same rules, which worked beautifully when you were fighting other Principality ships in a controlled exercise or in some house conflict or another. But it was suicidal against anyone who didn't care about those traditions. On screen, the 8th novice entered the asteroid field. Novice Petra Dainton, a quiet girl who flew competently but never well enough to draw attention. Smart. Wyatt respected the strategy even if he couldn't bring himself to adopt it. Dainton followed the doctrine precisely to the letter. Prescribed distance, correct vector, textbook approach. Beaumont Hale didn't even bother with anything creative. He simply waited at the predicted intercept point and fired when she arrived. 1 minute and 11 seconds. The shortest kill of the day. Dainton walked out of the simulation chamber with her jaw set and her eyes on the floor. She didn't make excuses. Commoners rarely did. There was no point in complaining about a system that wasn't designed to listen. Wyatt watched her take her seat and returned his attention to the display. The observation room had taken on the subdued atmosphere of a waiting room where everyone already knew the diagnosis. A few noble novices whispered among themselves, their earlier confidence visibly eroding with each successive elimination. The commoners said nothing. They never did. 9 novices remained, including himself. He had spent the last 7 eliminations not watching his classmates die. That was a given. Instead, he studied the man who killed them. Beaumont Hale's habits were now catalogued with the same precision Wyatt applied to everything. The instructor favored a high left approach after the initial engagement. He consistently repositioned behind the second-largest asteroid cluster after each kill. He over-relied on his target's predictability, and he grew lazier in the final seconds of each engagement because he never expected resistance. The man was a competent simulation pilot, competent against opponents who telegraphed every move before they made it. Against anything unpredictable, anything that deviated from the script he had written for both sides of the engagement? He would struggle. Wyatt was certain of it. He had watched the instructor hesitate for a fraction of a second when Ashworth's fighter had drifted slightly off the expected vector. A fraction of a second was an eternity in a dogfight. "Novice Aldwin Mercer, you are next." Mercer rose from his seat with the swagger of a boy who had already decided that his predecessors had simply lacked his natural talent. The silver and green crest of House Mercer caught the light as he walked toward the simulation chamber, and Wyatt felt the corners of his mouth twitch with the ghost of amusement he would never allow to fully form. This should be educational, Wyatt thought. It was. Mercer lasted 1 minute and 23 seconds, which was 16 seconds longer than Wyatt had expected, and entirely down to the fact that one of his wild, panicked, evasive turns accidentally put an asteroid between himself and Beaumont Hale's firing solution. The reprieve was brief. Mercer overcorrected, stalled his approach vector, and Beaumont Hale ended him with a single coil gun burst. Mercer stormed out of the chamber with a face like a clenched fist. "He wasn't following standard counter-engagement protocol," he spat as he threw himself into his seat. "No, Lord Mercer, he wasn't. That's rather the point, isn't it?" countered Wyatt in the safety of his mind. But it wasn't the point, not for Beaumont Hale anyway. The instructor wasn't teaching them that doctrine had limitations. He was teaching them that he was superior, that the hierarchy of noble instructor over novice held true even in the cockpit. The lesson was obedience, not tactics. It had always been obedience. 3 more novices entered the asteroid field. 3 more were destroyed. 1 noble, 2 commoners. The noblewoman raged at the proctor about unfair conditions. The commoners walked out in silence, as they always did. The patterns were the same every time. Beaumont Hale waited, the novice approached on a predictable vector, and the instructor punished them for doing exactly what he had told them to do. Wyatt tracked every kill, 12 down now. He noted that Beaumont Hale's response time had slowed marginally over the last 2 engagements. The instructor was getting comfortable, bored even. He had settled into a rhythm, repositioning to the same cluster, favoring the same high left angle, expecting the same docile targets flying the same docile patterns. His guard was as low as it would ever be. Good. "Novice Wyatt Staples, you are next." The observation room shifted. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Wyatt felt it. A change in the air, a slight turning of heads, the particular quality of attention that his classmates always paid him when his name was called for an exercise. Not respect, not exactly. Something closer to morbid curiosity. The commoners knew he was the best pilot among them. The nobles knew it too, though they would sooner eat their own crests than admit it aloud. Wyatt pushed himself off the wall, unfolded his arms, and walked toward the simulation chamber without hurry. His face betrayed nothing. His heartbeat was steady. His mind was already in the asteroid field, already running the calculations, already mapping the sequence of moves that no textbook had ever taught him because no textbook had ever needed to account for a commoner who could fly like this. He stepped into the chamber, the door sealed behind him. The cockpit initialized around him, sensors humming to life. The familiar weight of simulated flight controls settling into his hands as they belonged there. Because they did. The asteroid field materialized on his display, a dense, tumbling maze of rock and shadow. The same killing ground that had claimed 12 novices before him. Beaumont Hale's voice came through the comms, carrying the same board authority he'd used for every novice before him.
"Novice Staples, you may begin your approach. Approved tactics only. Let's not waste each other's time."
"No, sir. Let's not," the novice chanted in his mind. Wyatt engaged his engines and flew into the asteroid field. He did not follow the prescribed approach vector. For a whole minute he flew as the others had, following the pre-established path. But when the moment came to pass the asteroid fields, everything changed in the blink of an eye. He did not announce his heading, did not call out his maneuver, did not do a single thing that the 800 years of accumulated wisdom Beaumont Hale had spent an hour lecturing them about would have demanded. Instead, the moment his engines fired, he rolled his fighter 90 degrees starboard and dove beneath the asteroid field's central plane, cutting his thrust to minimal output and letting momentum carry him into the shadow of the largest rock cluster in the grid. The cockpit hummed with the low vibration of idling systems and the soft pulse of his sensor display. On it, Beaumont Hale's fighter sat exactly where Wyatt knew it would be, tucked behind the second-largest asteroid cluster, high and to the left of the entry corridor, waiting at the precise intercept point where 12 novices before him had obediently delivered themselves to be destroyed. You haven't moved, sir. 12 kills from the same position and you haven't moved once. Either you're supremely confident, or you've forgotten what it feels like when the target doesn't cooperate. Let's find out which, said Wyatt in his mind eagerly. He kept his thrust low, navigating by drift and minor corrections, using the gravitational eddies of the tumbling rocks to mask his signature. It was a technique no instructor, as far as he was aware, at the academy had ever taught because no one had ever needed to hide from anything. But Wyatt had spent a year in the simulators during the rare, precious hours when commoners were permitted access, and he had spent those hours not practicing approved maneuvers but testing limits beyond them. Not because anyone had told him it was useful, because it was obvious. The doctrine said you announced yourself. The doctrine said you approached at prescribed distances. The doctrine said you fought with honor, with structure, with the rigid choreography of a system designed for two opponents who had mutually agreed to make themselves easy targets. The doctrine, Wyatt had concluded approximately 47 minutes into Beaumont Hale's first lecture, was a mutual suicide pact dressed up in tradition, and he had no interest in dying for something so stupid. He threaded between two slowly rotating rocks, close enough that the proximity alerts flickered amber before he silenced them. Beaumont Hale's fighter remained stationary on his display. The instructor's sensors would be scanning the entry corridor, waiting for the predictable bloom of an approaching engine signature on the standard vector. He would be expecting it within the first 15 seconds after reaching the asteroid fields. By 20 seconds, he would begin to wonder. By 30, he would start looking. Wyatt intended to be behind him by then. He angled his approach around the outer edge of the asteroid cluster, staying below the sensor horizon of the larger rocks. The gap between the cluster and the boundary of the simulation space was narrow, barely 2 ship lengths across, the kind of margin that the approved doctrine would have classified as reckless and the kind that Wyatt classified as adequate. He had flown tighter gaps in his bunk, running the numbers in his head during the long hours when sleep wouldn't come, and the ceiling offered nothing but scratched metal and the ghosts of commoners who had lain there before him. A minute and 22 seconds since the simulation began. On the display, Beaumont Hale's fighter shifted. A minor adjustment, a slight rotation of the sensor array. The instructor was looking. Not alarmed, not yet. Merely curious. The script called for a novice to appear on the standard vector, and the novice had not appeared. This was an irregularity, and Beaumont Hale's entire career had been built on the comfortable absence of irregularities. Wyatt allowed himself 2 seconds of cold, focused satisfaction. "You're looking the wrong way, sir." He cleared the edge of the cluster. Beaumont Hale's fighter was directly ahead, 300 meters oriented away from him at approximately 40 degrees off his nose. The instructor's engines were cold, his weapons dormant, his posture that of a man waiting in an ambush he was entirely certain would not be turned against him. 150 meters. Wyatt's fingers settled over the weapons controls with the calm precision of a surgeon selecting an instrument. His targeting reticle drifted across the back of Beaumont Hale's fighter, and for a fraction of a second, so brief that only a pilot with reflexes bordering on preternatural would have caught it, a small icon appeared on the instructor's hull outline. The reactor housing, unshielded from the rear because the approved doctrine never accounted for an engagement from behind. Why would it? Honorable combatants faced each other. Only savages and pirates attacked from the blind spot. 80 meters. Wyatt's heart rate did not change. His breathing remained the steady, measured rhythm of controlled flight. His mind was quiet in the way it only ever was in a cockpit. The noise of the academy, the punishments, the hierarchy, the grinding indignity of being a commoner in a place built to remind him of it every waking moment. All of it gone. Replaced by the clean geometry of angles and distances and the pure, undeniable mathematics of a kill. 50 meters. It was time. He fired. 2 bursts. Short, precise, placed with the surgical economy of a pilot who understood that ammunition was finite and showing off was for people who could afford to miss. The first struck the reactor housing dead center. The second hit the port engine nacelle a half-second later. Not because it was necessary, but because Wyatt wanted the simulation to register a confirmed double loss, reactor critical and propulsion failure. He wanted the record to be unambiguous. He wanted the numbers to say what no commoner was ever permitted to say aloud. "I was behind you, sir. You never knew I was there," he thought with satisfaction. Beaumont Hale's fighter flashed red, then static, then the flat gray of a terminated simulation entity. The engagement timer froze. Wyatt glanced at it. 1 minute and 31 seconds. Engagement complete. He sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands still resting on the controls. The satisfaction was there, bright and sharp, and he did not bury it this time. Not yet. He gave himself 3 seconds to feel it, a luxury he rarely permitted, before the mask settled back into place and the calculations resumed. 3 minutes against the drone formation last time had earned him 2 weeks of polishing Mercer's boots. Killing the instructor's fighter in 1 minute and 31 seconds would earn him something considerably worse. He had known it before he entered the chamber, had calculated the cost with the same precision he had used to calculate the approach vector. He had done it anyway because the alternative was a different kind of defeat. The kind that didn't show up on a simulation score but calcified somewhere inside you, one small surrender at a time, until the pilot was gone and all that remained was obedience shaped like a person. Warlow's voice, distant but clear. The Principality doesn't just use commoners, Wyatt. It reshapes them, files down everything that makes them dangerous until all that's left is obedience. Not today, Mr. Warlow, he whispered to himself. The cockpit powered down. The simulation chamber door hissed open. Wyatt unstrapped, stood, and walked out. The observation room was silent, not the subdued quiet that had settled as novice after novice took their seats in defeat. This was the held breath, rigid-spined silence of 24 people who had just watched something they did not know how to process. On the overhead display, the replay showed the final frame, Beaumont Hale's fighter dead in space. 1 minute and 31 seconds. 0 damage sustained. 2 bursts fired. All hits. Wyatt walked to his place at the rear of the room, leaned against the wall, folded his arms, and waited. Among the commoners, Petra Dainton glanced at him once, briefly, before returning her gaze to the floor. The black-haired teenager smiled in his mind. She knows exactly what that's going to cost me. Smart girl. As if invoked by his mental ramblings, the door to the instructor's simulation pod opened, and the observation room somehow grew quieter still. Beaumont Hale did not storm out. He did not rage. He walked out slowly, jaw welded shut, and stood at the center of the room with the particular stillness of a man exercising every last measure of self-control. His dull silver eyes found Wyatt at the back of the room. Novice Staples, step forward. Wyatt walked to the front and stood at attention. You were given a direct order. Approve tactics only. Beaumont Hale's voice was level, controlled, each word placed with deliberate care. You chose to disregard that order. You flew without announcing your vector. You engaged from concealment. You attacked from behind without warning like an honorless pirate. Wyatt said nothing. Not only would arguing against something with that kind of certainty be akin to trying to convince a bulkhead to move, but if he said anything, without being granted permission to speak, it would only make things worse. But he catalogued the tell buried beneath the measured fury, the faintest tremor in the instructor's voice when he said without warning, not anger, fear. A commoner novice had been sitting behind him with weapons locked, and he had not known. That was what terrified Aldrich Beaumont Hale. He had been bested by not only an inferior but a mere plebeian at that. He would not, could not let that affront to his ego go unpunished. Your conduct constitutes gross insubordination and willful violation of a direct order. Under Article 14 of the Academy's Code of Discipline, you are hereby sentenced to 15 lashes, to be administered publicly before the assembled year group at morning parade. 15 lashes. The number landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere among the commoners, a murmur from the noble contingent. 15 was serious, enough to leave marks that would take weeks to heal, and a message that would last considerably longer. Wyatt did not flinch. Understood, sir. Beaumont Hale studied him for a long moment, searching for the crack, the flinch, the flicker of fear that would confirm what he needed to believe, that the punishment had reached something inside the boy. He didn't find it. Dismissed. All of you. Wyatt saluted, turned, and walked toward the door. He was already calculating the aftermath, not the lashes. Those would come and go. What he was calculating was the note that would be added to his file. The quiet, administrative revenge that men like Beaumont Hale extracted with the one weapon a commoner could never defend against. Paperwork. He didn't know what form it would take, but he knew it was coming. In the corridor, Mercer was leaning against the wall in what was becoming an annoyingly habitual pose. 15 lashes, Staples, Mercer said with the satisfied warmth of a boy watching someone else receive what he believed they deserved. Perhaps next time you'll remember that there are rules for a reason. Wyatt stopped. He regarded Mercer for precisely 1 second. Perhaps, Lord Mercer, he said. Then, because he had already earned 15 lashes, and the words were free, though I notice you lasted 1 minute and 23 seconds following those rules, 19 of which were spent running. He didn't wait for the reaction. He turned and walked away, leaving Mercer standing in the corridor with an expression that suggested several competing emotions were fighting for control of his face, none of them winning. 15 lashes. A commoner's price for proving that 800 years of doctrine could be undone in 1 minute and 31 seconds by a boy with a worthless commoner boy from an unimportant colony world and with no intention of flying the way they told him to. It's going to hurt like nothing else, but it was worth it, thought Wyatt, marking his little final victory in his mind. The parade ground was open to the void. Not literally, of course. The Academy's designers had enclosed it in reinforced transparent steel panels that offered an unobstructed view of the stars beyond the station's hull. It was meant to inspire awe. Wyatt had always thought it was a strange choice for a space that was used, with uncomfortable regularity, to beat the shit out of people. The entire year group stood in formation, 112 novices in 4 neat rows, nobles at the front, commoners at the rear as they always were. Wyatt stood at the post. A vertical steel bar with restraint clamps at wrist height bolted to the deck at the center of the parade ground, cleaned between uses, which suggested it saw enough use to warrant a cleaning schedule. He had removed his tunic as instructed and stood bare from the waist up, his wrists locked into the clamps, his face toward the transparent steel and the stars beyond. He could see the reflection of the formation behind him in the glass, 100 ghostly figures watching in silence. The disciplinary officer stood to his left with a regulation lash, a braided composite strap designed to inflict maximum pain with minimum permanent damage. The Academy was not wasteful. Scars kept novices out of training. Welts healed quickly and served as walking reminders. Beaumont Hales stood on the raised platform to the right of the post, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression one of solemn duty. He had dressed in his formal instructor's uniform for the occasion, the commendations for administrative diligence polished to a shine. Wyatt could see him in the transparesteel's reflection and noted, with the detached precision that had become his primary survival mechanism, that the man looked pleased, not overtly. Beaumont Hale was too practiced for that. But the set of his shoulders, the slight elevation of his chin, the way his weight settled comfortably into his heels, all of it spoke of a man who believed the natural order was about to be publicly restored. "Novice Wyatt Staples," Beaumont Hale announced, his voice carrying across the silent parade ground with the practiced projection of a man who had given this speech before. "You have been found guilty of gross insubordination, willful violation of a direct order during a graded combat exercise, and conduct unbecoming of a novice of this academy. The sentence is 15 lashes. Punishment will be administered now." The first lash landed across his upper back with a crack that echoed off the transparasteel panels. Pain, immediate and sharp, bloomed across his shoulders and raced down his spine. His hands tightened in the restraints. His jaw locked. He did not make a sound. The second landed 2 inches below the first. Pain. Oh, how he hated pain. But he endured it. He would not give them the satisfaction, at least not easily. The third crossed both. By the fourth, the pain had settled into a rhythm, each stroke building on the last, the individual lines of fire merging into a single spreading heat that consumed his entire back. His vision blurred at the edges. His breathing came harder, each exhale controlled and deliberate, the same technique he used to manage G-forces in a hard turn. Pain was a physiological response. It could be managed. It could be endured. It could not be avoided, but it could be refused permission to dictate his behavior. Then came the 5th, then the 6th, and the 7th. The formation watched in silence. Among the commoners in the back rows, the expressions were stone. They had seen this before. Some of them had stood where he was standing. 8. Wyatt's brain was swimming in pain. 9th. The darkness looked so inviting. Beaumont Hale's reflection showed a man whose satisfaction had deepened with each stroke. The instructor stood a fraction straighter now, his chin a fraction higher. The natural order was being restored, one lash at a time. The commoner who had forgotten his place was being reminded of it, publicly and painfully, and the lesson would be absorbed by every novice present. This was how the system worked. This was how it had always worked. 10th. Had it been worth it? Hold! The voice did not come from Beaumont Hale. It came from behind the formation, from the direction of the observation gallery that overlooked the parade ground. It was a quiet voice, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone who did not need volume to be obeyed. The disciplinary officer stopped mid-swing on what was meant to be the 11th lashing. Beaumont Hale's reflection shifted, his composed expression fracturing for just a moment as he turned toward the gallery. Wyatt did not turn. He couldn't, and wouldn't have, even if the restraints allowed it. But in the transperisteel's reflection, he saw a figure descending the gallery stairs with the measured pace of someone who had earned the right to take their time. A senior officer, that much was clear from the cut of the uniform alone, but it was the chest that told the real story. Even in the distorted reflection, Wyatt could make out the rows of ribbons, and among them, unmistakable even at this distance, the dark crimson bar of a combat distinction and the paired silver wings of an active service flight commendation. Not administrative, not accumulated years behind a desk. The kind of ribbons that were earned in a cockpit, under fire, against enemies who did not follow the script. The officer reached the parade ground floor and walked past the formation without acknowledging it. He stopped beside Beaumont Hale on the platform and spoke quietly, too quietly for the formation to hear, but Wyatt caught fragments in the silence, simulation records and completion metrics, and the phrase useful asset, spoken with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating equipment rather than defending a person. Beaumont Hale's face underwent a rapid and poorly concealed series of transitions. Surprise, then resistance, then the tight-lipped compliance of a man who recognized superior rank and lacked the standing to argue with it. He leaned toward the senior officer and murmured something back, his tone urgent, his hands making a small, sharp gesture that Wyatt interpreted as a protest. The senior officer listened, then shook his head once. A single, unhurried motion that ended the conversation as cleanly as Wyatt's 2 shots had ended the simulation. Beaumont Hale straightened. When he spoke, his voice had lost none of its projection, but had gained a brittle edge that hadn't been there before. The sentence is amended. 10 lashes administered. Punishment concluded. Release the novice. The restraints opened. Wyatt lowered his arms slowly, feeling the pull of a braided skin across his back as his muscles shifted. The pain was a living thing now, radiating outward from 10 overlapping lines of fire. He stood straight. He did not reach for his tunic. He turned to face the formation, bare-backed, the welts visible to every novice present, and offered a regulation salute toward the platform. "Sir." "Thank you, sir." He held the salute until Beaumont Hale returned it with a curt mechanical nod that suggested the words had physically pained him. The senior officer had already turned away, climbing the gallery stairs without a backward glance. Whoever he was, he had not intervened out of sympathy. He had intervened because the simulation scores represented a resource, and damaging a resource beyond operational usefulness was against standard regulations. Wyatt understood the distinction clearly. He had not been saved. He had been assessed. He collected his tunic, pulled it on over the welts with the careful, unhurried movements of a boy who refused to let 112 people see him wince, and walked off the parade ground. His back burned. His hands were steady. Behind him, Beaumont Hale watched him go. Later that evening, in the privacy of his office, Flight Instructor Aldrich Beaumont Hale opened the personnel file of Novice Wyatt Staples and navigated to the postings recommendations section. He sat for a long moment, his dull silver eyes reflecting the glow of the display, his jaw working slowly as though chewing on something bitter. Then he began to type. Novice Staples demonstrates adequate baseline piloting competence, but exhibits a persistent and troubling pattern of insubordination, willful disregard for established doctrine, and a fundamental inability to operate within the command structures required of a Royal Navy officer. His conduct is disruptive to unit cohesion, and his temperament is unsuited to any posting requiring disciplined adherence to operational protocols. He paused. Read it back. Added a final line. Recommended posting upon graduation and completion of initial patrol duties, the lingering systems. Compost hauler. Novice Staples is moderately useful as a pilot, but has little respect for his betters. He must learn his lesson. Beaumont Hale saved the file, closed the display, and leaned back in his chair. The commendations for administrative diligence gleamed on the wall behind him. Outside his office, the academy hummed with the quiet industry of an institution that had been grinding commoners into compliance for 800 years and saw no reason to stop now. In the commoner dormitory, 3 decks below, Wyatt Staples lay face down on his bunk. The welts on his back throbbed with each heartbeat, a slow, pulsing reminder that would fade in days and scar in weeks and mean nothing at all in the span of a career that hadn't started yet. He stared at the metal wall beside his bunk. Somewhere in the administrative systems of this academy, he was certain, a man who couldn't fly was writing something about a boy who could. He didn't know what. He might never know. But the ledger in his mind, the one where he filed every cost and every slight with cold precision, added a new entry nonetheless. 2 more years. He closed his eyes and dreamed of stars.